What's up everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jonah White. I'm an independent apocalyptic author. So today I'm going to be talking about some things I learned when it came to writing a good chapter 1. Now this is very important because this is the first thing your readers are going to be reading 9 times out of 10. A prologue, yes, but a lot of people tend to skip prologues. So I'm really talking about the chapter 1, and I'm going to talk about why chapter 1 is more important than your prologue. Because this is going to set us off on the journey and tell us what your story is headed for and what it's exactly about. And if readers are not hooked onto your chapter 1, they're not going to continue reading your book. And this is going to be devastating if you are planning on writing a series, because if they don't get through the first book, well, guess what? They're not going to get to book 2, 3, and so on. So before we get started, if you haven't already, feel free to like and subscribe to help support this channel. This not only helps support my channel, but this also lets me know that you enjoy this type of content, and I'll continue producing this type of content. And if you haven't known already, I'm currently in a YouTube series, and this is Journey to Publication on this channel, and this video here is part of that series. So this is a series where I'm going to be talking about journeying from thinking about the story in your head, putting it in your paper, all the way up until marketing and releasing that book, and what to do after the fact, and maybe some additional steps if you're planning on writing a series. So without further ado, let's get on with this video. Okay, so the first thing that I really learned when it came to writing a chapter 1, and that is to make sure that you start out following your main character, or at least one of them if you have multiple points of view or multiple main characters. Because the thing is, you want to start out with them because they're going to be the main focus of the story, and these are the characters, or this is the character that you're going to be following the entire story. Don't start off with some random janitor or some random nobody. And heck, don't even start out with the main antagonist. If you want to do something like that and give a different point of view, put that in a prologue, because we're not going to be following the antagonist, we're not going to be following some random person, so put that in the prologue. Right now we're here to follow the main character, and this is going to hook your readers onto the main character that you're trying to show us is important. And since we're going to be following them for the whole book, we kind of need to be introduced to them right out of the gate. And this kind of feeds into the second point, and that is to introduce us to your main character's personality, as well as show us some traits, show us what type of person they're like. Now I'm not talking about getting into backstory, or trying to immediately start developing them, or show their you can show their flaws, but don't get into full backstory. We don't need to know their whole history or how they got to this point yet, because right now we're trying to kickstart this plot and get us excited to read the rest of the plot, and then all that information can come when it's relevant. But at least give us a sense of who your character is personality wise, as well as show us some interesting traits about them, or what makes them special or unique. That way your character doesn't become so forgettable within the first chapter, and it's okay, this character just feels just a generic person that I forgot about, so I'm not going to continue reading this book. So make sure that you make your character distinguishable and show some of their traits or personality within that first chapter. Now, one pitfall that I did fall into when first writing my first chapter, and I did fix this in editing a lot, but that was trying to jam a lot of information about the world, or my main character's backstory, because I felt like I was obligated to put all the information in the first chapter. And no, you're not, because you're just going to bore your audience, and you're just throwing them way too much information right off the start for them to remember. Now you can introduce some information that's relevant to that point, but you don't need to start building the world, or explaining what happened to the world. Especially for me as an apocalyptic author, I was trying to describe okay, how did the world get to this point, and it was such awkward exposition and everything. And we just have to remember, we have a whole book to go to explain some of this stuff, or kind of drop that information for the audience. Right now your audience is trying to find a reason to care about your book in the first chapter, as well as find a reason to keep going. They don't really care about the world or your character's backstory because they just started. You need to give them a reason to care before they are concerned about their backstory or like the world that you're trying to set up. So don't go into info dumping because then you're going to just overwhelm your audience with like information that they're going to try to keep in their head, and most of us are going to forget a lot of that information if you just throw it at us right out the gate. Only introduce very little when it's necessary, but your goal here is to kickstart the plot and introduce us to the main character and give us a sense of what's going on or what the plot's going to be about. Okay, so another tip that I learned, and I suggest a lot of you do, is that don't start your first chapter in a dream sequence. Now, a lot of new writers try to do this, and I don't like it, and this isn't a good idea because you don't want to start off your chapter like with a dream sequence where you're just like fooling your audience or trying to outsmart them. Like it's like, okay, we're invested in everything, but then at the end of the chapter, it's like, oh, that was all a dream. So all of that's just useless information that we just learned. And then what that does is that you started the film, got your audience maybe invested, but then by chapter 2, you're restarting your story, and your audience has to like reset their brains to like figure out what the plot's about and like learn what's actually going on. You don't want to give your plot a sense that it's constantly restarting, and that kind of feeds into the second section of this point, and that is don't throw your first chapter like thousands of years before the main timeline, the story goes on, because that's meant for a prologue to take up that burden. But the first chapter, you don't want to like start it like, oh, at this point, but then we're going to do a major time skip. Like, yeah, time skips can be good, but most of the time this can be a trap, and it can also lead to the same thing as a dream sequence where you're just going to be restarting the story once we catch up with the main timeline. Like, if you want to do a time skip, you can use a prologue for that, but don't do it for the main chapter. You want to start it as close as to that inciting incident, and that leads to the next point, and that is start your first chapter as close to the inciting incident as possible, because we want to make sure that this first chapter is exciting and it's as close to that inciting incident as possible. Now, if you don't know what the inciting incident is, this is an event that kickstarts your plot, or at least gives us a sense. It's an event that lets us know what this plot is about. So you want to start it as close to that as possible. Another thing that you want to do with your first chapter is actively have your main characters involved in the plot or moving towards that inciting incident. Now, one example of this is the first chapter can open up with like a bank heist going on, but a boring way of like showing this bank heist is like having your main character just a bystander, maybe just filming this bank heist from outside the building. They're not actively involved. They're not trying to accomplish anything. They're just filming this bank heist and maybe a shootout between the police and the robbers. And then the robbers get away or the police catch them, and then meanwhile your character's just standing there filming it on their phone. That's boring because we don't really care about the bank heist and everything because your main character isn't involved in some way. Now, another way you could do this is that maybe your main character is maybe an off-duty cop, and then they try to like get involved in this situation to stop the robbers, or they could be inside the bank making a transaction when this all goes down, and maybe they're trying to save lives, or they're trying to get away, or at least survive from being taken as hostage or being killed in the crossfire during this. That way you can like actively have your characters involved with what's going on in chapter 1. You don't want them to be passive or just a bystander, because then the audience is going to be bored, because like, well, I really don't care about what's going on because my main character isn't really pursuing anything and they aren't actively in this plot. And if you do show something like maybe he's an off-duty cop and then he tries to get involved, maybe you can display some traits in there like, yeah, he's off duty, but he's going to try everything in his power to try to save people. That way you can like not only actively have your character involved in this chapter, but you can also show some traits like he cares about people and he wants to keep them safe, and he'll do anything to make sure that he can save as many lives as possible. So always have your main character actively participating in the plot in some way. Don't have them just so passive or like getting dragged around with the plot, or the plot will just play out the same with your character there or not. So another thing that I learned when it came to this, and this is a mistake that I did in the first draft of my first book, its first chapter, and that is trying to describe way too much in this world or what's going on. Like sometimes my character was like talking to certain people, and it's like we weren't gonna see these people again, so I was like going to detail what these people look like and everything, and you don't have to do that. If we're not gonna see these characters again, like for instance, like if your main character is going to like a coffee shop in the first chapter and then they are paying the cash register or the cashier, you don't want to describe this cashier, especially if we're not going to see him again, because it's not useful information, and you're kind of like giving your audience a sense that they need to remember this description or remember this information, and they're going to be holding that for a long time, and they're going to want some payoff for all that setup that you gave these characters. And if they aren't going to revisit this coffee shop, you can describe it to give your readers like a sense of immersion that they're in this coffee shop with this character, but don't go into full detail as if this coffee shop is going to be playing a major part in the plot, or we're going to be here a while, or we're going to come back, or it's going to be relevant. Just do enough to give immersion, but don't do it to the point where you're giving your audience a false sense that this information is super important that they need to hold on to for the rest of the story. And plus then you're gonna like just bog down your story in detail, and you're going to like really have your first chapter feel like it's doing the stop and go momentum, and it's not really driving towards the inciting incident. So another pitfall you don't want to fall into when it comes to this, to writing a first chapter, is like showing like a long boring summary of like your main character's daily routine. Like you show them get up from bed, wash their hands, make breakfast and everything, go to work, get gas, and then like head into the office and such and so, or like they go in the school bus and they go to school, open up their locker and everything. Just saying that alone just sounds overwhelming and it's boring. Now yes, we do this in real life, but the thing is, we're writing a book here and we don't have time to describe all that information. Remember, your story, in order to keep it exciting, it needs to have momentum and it needs to get to the point, and every single scene or section needs to have a point. Now, if you want to show some of their daily routines to show how unique they are, or maybe you show like how good of a life they have or how bad of a life they have, this can work, but try to avoid the whole like daily routine, because that's just going to be so much information that we don't need. So the final tip I would like to share with you guys, and this is something that I truly learned and I'm still going to be holding it for the rest of my life, but after writing that first chapter and really thinking about it, move on and write the rest of the book. Don't get bogged down in this first chapter, because the thing is, if you move on and write the whole story, then you can look at the whole story in relation to that first chapter and really see what you need to change, or see if there's information that first chapter reveals that is important, or you can cut out some filler stuff, but finish that whole story. That way you get an overall view of like whether your first chapter is good or not. And if you want extra feedback, you can like go on Facebook groups and everything and find beta readers, and you can just ask people like, hey, you don't have to read my whole book, just at least read my first chapter and tell me if you would consider buying my book if you were to read this. So that's gonna conclude this video on how to write a good chapter 1. Now this was very hard for me because when I wrote my first book, because I was so bogged down like trying to create that perfect chapter 1, and I also fell into some of the pitfalls of like describing too much or like trying to add too much backstory. And another thing is, if you're marketing your book and you want to give out teasers like, oh, here's the first chapter, or here's the first few chapters of my book, and people are not hooked by that first chapter, well, guess what? That teaser is going to just be a gateway to a big turnoff to your audience, and it's not going to benefit you. It's going to like do a disservice to you, because they're going to read this teaser that you released in the marketing and they're like, I don't really care about this book, so I'm not going to buy it. So if you like this video as part of my Journey to Publication series, feel free to like and subscribe. Follow me on my author site or Instagram channel. And without further ado, I'll see you next time. Happy writing and good day.